Good morning, everybody, or happy middle of the night if anybody is actually zooming in from Taiwan at this hour. Welcome to our final morning of this wonderful conference. I'm chairing this session, which is called New Sources for Taiwan Studies. But if you look at the paper titles, you'll realize that while they might all fit that title in some sense, they're all quite different from each other. And for that reason, I want to handle the question and answer a little bit different from how I think most of the other sessions, at least most of the ones I've been able to go to, were handled, and just do Q&A immediately after the paper presentation. So be prepared as the person is speaking with your questions. And if there's time, we can maybe we'll see if there's more general discussion at the very end, but we'll see. So what I've told the three paper presenters is they can each aim for 20 minutes for their presentation, and that would leave us with 10 minutes for discussion for each one. And if they babble on and ignore my warnings, it's their question time that's being cut into. So I will keep us on time, but that's the general structure. So don't think for an hour before you have your question about the first paper. So I'm going to introduce each one of them in turn, but in the minimal way, because I want to leave as much time for them as is possible. So our first speaker is Dominic Yang Mengxuan, who's from the Department of History at the University of Missouri.
Now, my paper is called Defectors from Taiwan to the PRC during the Cold War. And when Dr. Xiao looked at this topic, I said, Dominic, what are you trying to do? Is it because that there's going to be a war between Taiwan and China? Are you doing this military defection thing? Now I'm going to tell you. So this research, it really, with regard to the White Terror history of Taiwan in the 1950s, and in fact, it's a reconception of it based on this very large number of historical documents that I read in the archives in the 6 months that I was in Taiwan in 2021 and early 2022. Now, our ideas, of course, White Terror in Taiwan is the period is like 40 years, and there are many different phenomena. So we're talking about different periods. So the periods I'm talking about is the 1950s, especially the early 1950s. Now, our idea of the victims during this time is that this is right after the Chinese Civil War, and the nationalist regime was purging the Chinese communists. So our idea of the victims during this time composed of both Taiwanese and mainlanders, but a lot of them are Taiwanese, and intellectuals, political dissidents, and especially people who are affiliated with the CCP Taiwan Working Committee. So these people usually belong to certain reading groups. They all read the Marx work or Chairman Mao's work together, and they form resistance groups against the nationalist regime. And of course, within the span of a couple of years, they're all clear out. So this is our understanding of it. And of course, this work is also related to the idea of transitional justice, because if you have been to Taiwan, you're familiar with the discourse of transitional justice in Taiwan, you would have heard this phrase, truth leads to justice, and justice in turn leads to reconciliation. Now, as a historian, what I'm trying to argue here with this research on the military defections in early 1950s Taiwan is that our perception or our imagination or our understanding of the historical truth is actually not complete and not comprehensive. So how can we get to the justice and reconciliation part, because we haven't really found the whole of the truth. So and I would like to sort of, before I show you my main argument and the documents, would like to show you, this is because we will have certain ideas about the victims in the 1950s, right? And this is reflected in popular culture. in literature, in films, and movie. And this is really shown, all of this is really shown through this film, which I think everybody watch. It has origins in a very popular online video game, right? It's called Detention. It's white terror trauma. And I would argue this movie sort of represents Taiwanese society's collective imagination of past victimhoods, especially the ones in the 1950s, although the setting was in the early 60s. But it is really based on our understanding of what these victims were, who they belong to, the kind of the group that, it's usually, young teachers organizing underground reading groups, and these people are intellectuals, and us, along with many of the main themes you see in this movie, youth and innocence, the quest for freedom, resistance, liberation from oppression. Of course, there's also betrayal, guilt, and psychotic compulsive return to the traumatic event. So this is all in the storyline, in the original video game, and in the cinematographic effect of this movie, right? But beside the storyline is based on historical work, or the dominant historical present interpretation of what constitute white terror victims and victimhood. So now so the gist of my research, the white terror, and I'm talking about the white terror in the mainlander dominated militaries, which is not that talked about. If you look at the number of known white terror victims, the tallies that actually made by the Taiwanese government, especially through the TCR, the Truth and the Transitional Justice Commission. Among the 20,000 known white terror victims, 42% of them were mainlanders and 57% Taiwanese. And you see that the number of mainlanders are extremely high because their population there's only 10% of the Taiwanese population. So, but why don't we hear about them? There's a few number of mainlander intellectuals that were leading these local Taiwanese leftists and communists. Of course, they're part of the pool of victims. And you also have these liberal intellectuals who were put in jail by Chiang Kai-shek. I mean, the most famous instance that everyone knows is in the late 50s and early 60s with the 自由中国, the Free China magazine. We know about all of that, right? They're part of the mainlander victims. But I can tell you the largest number of mainlander victims actually came from this part. And it's all in this stretch of 1950 to 1954, where you see the largest number of especially incarceration and especially execution in the military. If you look at the white terror statistics, right, you'll see that 90% of the people who were ever executed by the regime, they were in the 1950s, especially in the 1950s, and especially in the military. So how does this happen, and why don't we talk about it? So let's look at it here. It's usually through these cases called Panluan, or usually, and by the way, if you look at the white terror reparation committee, it's called Panluan Ji Feidie Budang Shenpan, right? Panluan comes before, like the treasonous act comes before spies, because only 10% of the people were charged with crimes of being communist spy. A huge number were actually, these people are treasonous. They're plotting against the state. And when you're in the military, you try to escape from the military, then you're plotting against the state. You're trying to defect to the enemy, right? So now, and I said these mainlanders, the reason that they plot against, or they didn't really plot against the state, they just want to escape from the military and go home. So they're persecuted, jailed, and executed, not for the political belief, or the leftist Marxist belief of wanted to overthrow the government, but simply wanted to go home. And I have two main arguments, for this work. One is that the high number of defection cases or attempts of defection in the early 1950s in the nationalist military was the result of the Chinese Civil War. The second is that, and this is important, the military was not only the main instrument of state violence, its members also formed the bulk of the White Terror victims in the 1950s. Now, the implication of this research, why are we doing this research? What's the greater meaning of it? Because people ask me that, are you trying to, explain the way White Terror? You're trying to justify the KMT action. They have justification for killing the Taiwanese because a lot of them were communists, right? After the 228, they joined a communist organization because they're fighting collective. They want to fight collective against the national state. Oh, and in this case, yeah, because it's war, you want to keep the soldiers from escaping, right? So it's all justified. No, this is not why I'm doing this. As a historian, it is my responsibility to explain to the public that things happen for a reason. There's causality, but there's also the ethic of historical representation, and that's very important. So the reason I'm doing this, the implication of this research, is the direction I also want to argue, is seeing the KMT mainlander-dominated military in the 1950s, and also later on, the military still has this legacy of very closely connected to the KMT, and it remains a problem in Taiwan today, right? But by presenting the research like that, I want to, to change our fundamental perception of the military, especially on the part of the Taiwanese society, to see military as a part of the Taiwanese society. They also suffer the White Terror. And to reimagine the society's relationship with the military via historical research to build mutual understanding, reconciliation, and the trust between the military and society, because Taiwan really needs this against an increasingly militant PRC. Okay, now, so this is about the origins of the research, right? Why would I get onto this research? This research is really a spin-off of my book, The Great Exodus from China, Trauma, Memory, and Identity in Modern Taiwan. So yeah, just a little bit advertisement for the book and the awards that it has won. So enough self-congratulation here. And other inspiration is this very fabulous work done mostly not by historians, but by sociologists in Taiwan about White Terror history in the 1950s. So there are a whole bunch of them. I'm specifically referring to work of Professor Lin Chuan-Kai. Of course, he interviewed the White Terror victim that are mostly Taiwanese, and they joined the CCP organization. But when he did the interview with them in the 1990s, and this is across the board. It's the phenomenon. The people, because they wanted to get compensation, right? So they came out and say they don't belong to any communist organization. It's, they're just innocent of views. It's kind of like in that movie, right? They're all idealistic people, and they just get together in the reading group. They're all intellectuals. Of course, they all anti-government, because when you live under authoritarian system, that's your natural reaction, right? If you're intellectual, if you like independent thinking. But Professor Lin found out that a lot of people later changed their story, and especially in the late 2000s, and when circumstances change, when the entire Taiwanese society become more tolerant of difference of opinions, and also when there's more research being done, especially archival sources coming out with the declassification of these documents. And by the way, I give credit to Tsai Ing-wen's government for sort of enacting the law of transitional justice, for forcing the bureaucracies, and especially the military bureaucracies, to release these documents. Otherwise, we won't know about all of these. And also the other work that I'll mention before I move on to the documents, because I want to show you some actual examples of the documents that are read in the archives. So there are hundreds of pages of them. So I think I only have time for 2 examples here. But the other work that I would like to mention before that is Ye Hongling's 2015 article. And this is very important. And Ye Hongling, if you know transitional justice in Taiwan, she's actually the last acting chair of the Transitional Justice Committee. I mean, how she came to that position is another, it's a very long story. But anyway, she is this brilliant young scholar. And this article is about how the ideal victimhood that I just presented to you that's represented in the movie becomes like that. It's that how our idea of the 1950s white terror victim is solidified through institutionalized state-sponsored reparation, commemoration, and public education programs that is strongly shaped by civil organization and political victim groups associated with democracy and Taiwan independence movement, and especially, and of course, the people on the pearl green, the pan green side of the political spectrum in Taiwan. So when these people talk about white terror victims, first of all, they would not like to admit that, these people are communists. And a lot of these people who are communists in the 1950s still surviving today, if you go visit them, they'll tell you that they still believe in the final unification between China and Taiwan. And it was extremely difficult. You see, this is how you're going to represent this, right? So you turn them into innocent, relatively apolitical victim, right? And then the other thing is you don't talk about this other stuff. So many people executed by because they're all mainlanders. Mainlanders supposed to be the bad people. Okay, now. So let's look at two cases. A lot of these defections actually happen on the front line, and this is Jinmen. And this particular document I'm showing you is actually written by Zhang Jingguo himself. And at the time, Zhang Jingguo is because he is the head of the Security Bureau of the Ministry of Defense in Taiwan. And we all know that he is the architect of his father's, actually carrying out his father's suppression in Taiwan. And this is basically just, seven, as you can probably make out, there was a soldier, but there were 9 of his companions. They kill. They were put in a forward position in Xiaojinmen, in the Lesser Jinmen Island, and they kill off their entire platoon, 9 of them, and they swam across the border to Xiamen. And what's interesting about this document is that there wasn't any indication that there is a broadcast from the Chinese side, because usually when these swimmers made a successful attempt, there will be a broadcast because it's for propaganda. It's a victory for the PRC side, right? So these people probably drown in the water. And I would say there are hundreds, even thousands of people in the early 1950s attempted to do this. And this document also shows, you see, this is what I'm sometimes a little bit skeptical about these numbers, even the number that I just showed you, because you see in this document, this is recorded in the TJC number as one person's case. And this person is a mainlander. But he has 9 accomplices in this that's not named that also all die in this, okay? And also in this document, as you can see, that it also said that there were, 25 escaped on June 25th. That's actually, because this incident happened on September 1950, right? But June 26th, there were 25. 3 were shot when swimming in the water, and 1 was captured and then brought back and executed. You can read it yourself. June 30th, there's 3 in the water, 1 was caught and presumably executed, so on and so forth. So if you count the total number of people that are actually affected, I see more than 3 dozen. For me, they're all white terror victims, but the recording it's only 1 person. So that's interesting, isn't it? And also that if you look at this document, it's a very detailed document explaining why there's so many escape in this division. And the reason is very simple, because this division was formed in Jiangxi at the very end of the Civil War. And so it was a skeleton division with only officers. But when they pass on their way to Taiwan, they passed the Chaozhou area in Guangdong. So they went out and captured a lot of people. So When they got to Taiwan, 70% of the division was made up of these draftees from Chaozhou area. And when they were put in the forward position, hey, China is over there and it's very close to our home. So a lot of them made the attempts, right? And of course, those ones were executed. Okay, so you see, I'm not going to go too much in detail because I want more time for discussion and questions, and maybe those things will come out. And the document is very long. It goes on to, by reading a document like this very early on, you can see that a lot of the control mechanisms that they put into the military were later used on the civilian population. This is how you should understand white terror in Taiwan. It started in the military when they're fighting this war against the communists. Now, this second and case that this is the last, I think, yeah, probably the last slide I'm going to show you. This is an Air Force pilot who tried to stow a plane in Hsinchu Air Base, and this happened in 1956. And this actually happened quite often in the 1950s. Well, you don't hear a lot about it because if you read the newspaper, there will be no reports because these will be considered defeat, right? And the people coming over from China, from PLA Air Force, all be a victory. These people will be like 反攻意识, 家鸡投奔自由. They will be celebrated. But there are actually more defections from the Taiwanese side, and they're never reported, but they're investigated. Those ones were made, it was celebrated by the PRC, right? Okay. But so, and in this case was, he didn't make it. He was put on watch by the nationalists. And I interviewed someone in Taiwan for my mainlander project who said that he was in the same cell with this Cantonese pilot who, because the person that I interviewed, he was 13 years old when he was kidnapped on Zhoushan Island. And he said he was put in jail with this person. And he really admired him because if you're an Air Force pilot, you're educated, and he speaks English, 25 years or 28 years old when he was executed. And so he spent about 3 years with my interviewee. And yeah, he told me a very touching story when he was taken out to be shot, right? And so anyway, I think I'm going to sort of end there. It's just that there's just a lot more, like, hundreds of cases and, to look at. So anyway, that will be, I think I'll end it there. Thank you very much.
So just to remind you, there are a lot of people online, so we need to use the microphone in order to avoid repeating every question into the microphone. Could you please come up here? And you might, if your hand is up, you might as well just come up and be here. So you first, and Emily second, and anybody else who wants to come stand in.
Hi, Dominic. Thank you for the very interesting presentation. I only have one question, and my question is, I think at that time, so many mainlander defects, not because the mainlander have become part of the Taiwanese society. My view is exactly the opposite. I think because they are at the very core of the state apparatus, state oppressive apparatus. And the state oppressive apparatus was the military, which is the final defense of Chiang Kai-shek's power in Taiwan. And that's one of the reasons Chiang Kai-shek has very, very, very low tolerance for any defection from the military. Also, I'm not convinced they are part of the Taiwanese society, because I think if they really have become part of the Taiwanese society, for instance, they have married, they have settled down there, they have children there, they have stake in Taiwanese society, they know they will not defect to Taiwan. Yeah, and what do you think? Yeah.
Should I answer right away, or?
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Dr. Huang, for that question and comment. Yes, I think I definitely would agree with the idea that First of all, the oppressive state military apparatus part, of course, that's extremely obvious. That's something that I would like to show. The other one is about, yes, these people defected because this was so early, in the 1950s, right? They just got to Taiwan there, and a lot of them were forced to go to Taiwan. And if they were to stay in Taiwan, and this is what happened to the people who didn't make the attempt to escape, right? They, if they can find, local, partners and basically marry and settle down, they will have a stake in Taiwan. And of course, these developments have happened later on, right? And so, yeah, I totally agree with your point on that. Yes, and again, this goes back to why I'm doing this. I'm a historian, so I'm trying to turn back the clock to make you see the situation. If you want to fault military or military personnel for a certain type of thing, you need to put it in that context, right? Instead of saying that, oh, they have always been loyal to the KMT, all that stuff. Yeah.
Dominic, what a gold mine. Amazing material. And I really congratulate you for working so hard on it already. And your plans to persevere are exciting. I hope to follow them. I'm just thinking about the conceptualization as part of the White Terror. It looks as though White Terror is overlapping with the chaos of civil war. And if you look at whatever documents you can find, but the CCP would be happy to describe. CCP historians must have described the crimes of the Kuomintang military establishment at the end of the war, shooting deserters all over the place. So I'm wondering if you have looked at that. Even during the war against Japan, most draftees didn't make it to the front. So in the last days of the Civil War, it must not have been only chaotic but wretched for units, including draftees, reconstituted and sent to different parts of the front and retreating in disorderly fashion. So, thanks a lot.
Yeah, thanks, Emily, for that question. I think the question relates to, our general, understanding of the Civil War, so the social chaos created by the Civil War. And again, I'm sorry to say that, although I always have hoped to do archival research in China, about this part, right? It is extremely, extremely difficult, especially with the scholars, PRC scholars that I talked to personally. They said these documents might have existed and still exist in the military, but because it is something that will never show you, right? This is the, not even in the times of, like Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao, not to mention now, right? But, luckily Taiwan democratized and all these things were declassified. We're able to see, a glimpse of this. And really, like, one of the arguments I try to make in the book is the Chinese Civil War or Chinese Revolution, the idea of revolution is that it's for social justice, it's for a better society, right? But is it for a better society or just a brutal, civil war where people just kill one another and adding on the suffering and social chaos already created by decades of warfare in China, including the Japanese invasion? So yeah, that's one of the questions that I raised in my book. It's related to this research, but I raised that question in the book. Anyway, thanks very much for the question.
Are there any other questions for Dominic right now? All right, so we'll see, but hopefully there'll be a few minutes at the very end as well in case there are cross-cutting questions or anything like that. So let me introduce our second speaker, who's Evan Dolly at the History Department of Goucher College.
Thank you very much, Rob, and to everyone for coming this morning on the last morning of the conference, and particularly to the organizers and the sponsors of this great event. This is my first World Congress, so I'm really excited to be here today. My presentation today is, I guess, something of an interlude between the really important research that Dominic is doing in newly available sources and the big conceptual image of what is Taiwan that Nikki will give us all in a few minutes. my presentation is more of a sort of a pedagogical talk that I hope will make some sort of contribution to resolving one of the challenges that was actually under discussion in this room yesterday morning about how to sort of sustain public interest in Taiwan over the long term so that it doesn't sort of follow the ebbs and flows of geopolitics, although certainly geopolitics will come into it. So let me begin with making a statement that is really sort of painfully obvious, I think, to this audience at the Fourth World Congress of Taiwan Studies, which is that, right, scholars, students, and the general public really need to better understand Taiwan as Taiwan. That is, right, seems obvious to all of us, but in the world in general, the overwhelming majority of both academic and popular discourse about Taiwan, at least in the English language environment, really framed and continues to frame Taiwan primarily either in the context of cross-strait relations or as part of some other country. So even, I think for us, it bears reminding that it's really important to focus on Taiwan as Taiwan, partly because, well, Taiwan's long-standing prominence within regional and global networks really makes the study of its past and present vitally important. But that examination really has to center Taiwan in order to break down its long-standing marginalization in broader discourses. Now, when I say that, I don't mean that Taiwan should not be studied in relation to broader topics and questions. I think that's actually really essential, but it should be presented more, I think, on its own terms to a greater extent. There certainly has been a positive shift in this direction over the past couple of decades, such that I think following comments that David Fell and Gunther Schubert have made, and others have made, that, right, we may now find ourselves in a golden age of Taiwan studies. This conference, all the papers that I've been hearing over the last few days, conversations that I've had, the host institution here, right, the Taiwan Studies Center at the University of Washington, these are all indications of this positive trend. So I would say that research on Taiwan as Taiwan is indeed flourishing. But we all continue to face a number of difficulties in shifting from research to teaching. And the most significant of those difficulties, I really think, is a dearth of primary sources that can be used in English language classrooms, right? Graduate students, professors, researchers, all of us, we have pretty easy access to a wide range of written sources in Chinese and Japanese and other languages that have been used in and around Taiwan across its history. Those with proper linguistic training, i.e. not myself, can do really important field work or oral histories. But there's a much smaller body of materials that can be introduced to students at the undergraduate level. And what exists is mostly limited to a pretty narrow range of topics. I'm sure that I'm far from the first person to raise this issue. Many of you have been at this longer than I have, and maybe have been addressing and resolving this challenge in your own work. But the project that I'm going to focus on today, which is this website, Primary Sources on Taiwan, I think demonstrates that there is a substantial number of scholars out there who are trying to bring Taiwan into the classroom. And I would suggest that doing so would really facilitate the exposure of much larger numbers of non-specialists to the exploration of Taiwan's history, its politics, its society, and that would hopefully make Taiwan studies a bit less of a niche field. It would give it more representation across a whole range of disciplines. So let me talk a little bit about the current status of teaching Taiwan and sources that are available to us. So there's certainly a small market for translated sources from Taiwan. And I do think that geopolitical trends are going to make that demand increase, at least in the short term. But it is still a small demand. Right? There was, of course, a survey that we're all familiar with, and maybe many of us participated in, by NATSA, completed in 2018 for the United States and Canada. that revealed that there are a little over 100 courses that have been taught or are being taught that are entirely about Taiwan or that have significant attention to Taiwan. And these are at nearly 60 distinct institutions. But these totals are, of course, really tiny drops in the bucket of just North American academia. About 2% of institutions have such courses. And even if we were to expand that sample to places where English versions of Taiwanese sources could be used, it wouldn't be that dramatically different a situation, I don't think. Right, there are probably a lot more courses than made it into the NATSA survey that maybe have a session or two on Taiwan. But Taiwan, I think, doesn't really get a lot of attention as a standalone subject or a lot of attention as a case study in its own right in comparative frameworks. The limited availability of primary sources is definitely only one obstacle here, but it's nonetheless significant because sources matter to all of us, right? We agree with this. And without primary sources in particular, we as teachers cannot present Taiwanese voices to our students. And the NATSA survey, which has a really extensive list of sources that have been used, or books, articles, whatever, that have been used in all of these courses, it shows that with the exception of a really sizable supply of literature in translation and films that have been subtitled, there are almost no primary sources created in Taiwan that get used in these courses. And the reality is that very few are available to be used. So I'll show you the list that I'm sort of aware of. I had set up a fancy animation that I would have images of each of these, but sadly, I got a little ambitious with the technology. But for the 17th century, we have the great collections of Dutch and Spanish materials in translation. We've got the translation of the first Chinese travel log of Taiwan from 1696. And then between Yu Yonghe's travel log and then Wu Zhuoliu's novel, 1945. So between 1696 and 1945, there is almost nothing produced in Taiwan that exists in translation, at least that I'm aware of. I'm really hoping that the people here will sort of disabuse me of this ignorance. But we have a translation of this document by Ding Xiaoyi that I believe Emma Dung did, that is in a larger collection edited by Susan Mann. There is, of course, Takekoshi Yosaburo's somewhat hagiographical account of the first decade of Japanese rule. But again, right, between Yu Yonghe and Wu Zhuoliu, there is essentially nothing, at least that I am aware of. And even on that short list, the only thing that might qualify as something created internal to Taiwan is, of course, Wu Zhuoliu's work of fiction. Semi-autobiographical and incredibly useful, but still a work of literature. There are, as I'm sure many of us are aware, a number of things written by North Americans and Europeans from the 19th century, but again, these are not internal perspectives. For jumping ahead to the post-1945 period, again, there's a list of memoirs, of some oral histories that would help us to address Taiwanese identity, democratization, obviously the White Terror a little bit, and then down at the bottom there with the Daybreak Project, very recent political movements, especially the Sunflower Movement. So there's a little bit more for the post-1945 period that's available. But again, it's a very limited range of topics. And that limitation becomes, I think, even more evident when we consider the realities within which many of us work. Right, we're hired to teach China or Japan or all of East Asia to cover huge swaths of time and huge territories. And it's really hard to figure out how to bring in a book-length study or a book-length source into a course that has to cover 600 years and 7 countries. So what many of us rely upon, of course, are source readers in our general teaching. But the standard collections of sources that we, I'm sure, have all relied upon have barely a handful of materials out of Taiwan. There are a couple of things on 228. There are a few documents written by Jiang Jingguo during the martial law period. And that is, at least again, as far as I'm aware, kind of it. Except very, very recently, there's this project organized by Sayaka Chitani, grassroots operations of the Japanese Empire, that does have a few sources out of Taiwan, and we'll have a few more in the future. But again, there's really not much there. There's a gaping hole kind of waiting to be filled. And so into this void, and then amidst the global instability of the spring of 2020, came a serendipitous exchange of text messages that I had with Wayne Soon, historian of China and East Asia at Vassar College, who many of you I'm sure know as well. One day he messaged me and asked whether or not we should create a collection of primary sources in translation. And I agreed that we definitely should. So here we are in I think, April or May of 2020. That evolved very quickly into a proposal for an AAS roundtable that took place in 2021, sadly not here in Seattle. But at this initial roundtable, a small group of scholars presented translations that was explicitly a proof of concept that we could in fact create these sources. If anyone was in attendance there, you remember the circumstances were not ideal in that fully online environment, but we did actually have a pretty good group of people in attendance, a number of whom stuck around after, Dominic among them, stuck around after to help us think through what the project might turn into. And in pretty short order, we had developed our basic idea for the project from just Wayne and me into a group of about a dozen scholars who were ready to work on some translations. And we had a plan to create, again, a website, this website, that would house that initial set of materials. In this initial vision, right, we recognized that all of the participants were, and hopefully in the future will be, busy scholars with full research agendas of their own. And so we decided that we would build the translations from the ground up and ask people to just give us translations of things that they were already using in their own research. And then when we launched the website in the fall of 2021, essentially 18 months after our first exchange, so everyone I think did a tremendous work to get that running so quickly. We did end up with a somewhat scattered collection of sources from the 20th and early 21st centuries. They have introductions, some of them have reading questions, some of them have lists of additional readings, and they touch upon and they can be used to study a wide range of subjects, I think, including public health, international relations, domestic politics, colonialism, education, aesthetics, and a few other topics are in there. And we have a wide variety of sources, I think, including documents from the Government General of Taiwan, the ROC government, some textbooks from both the Japanese colonial and the martial law period, political and cultural manifestos, some doctors' clinical notes, some personal letters that Dominic has translated for us. So there's a growing collection of materials that I think illustrate how sources can be used and brought into undergraduate classrooms. And so let me now, I can maybe show an example later, or at least show the website in a moment. But let me talk now just here at the end about the future of the project, what we're looking forward to. So in the introduction to this website, we say that this is a living project, something that is going to be evolving. And so I want to sort of outline very, very briefly how we envision it evolving over time. So this fall, the current contributors are going to have a little workshop at the University of Pittsburgh. And this is important for a number of reasons, because as I mentioned, the currently available sources emerged in a somewhat ad hoc manner. And they are currently very wide-ranging in the areas that they address, which is a strength, but it's also kind of a limitation, right? We have a lot of surface and not a lot of depth. And we also, I think, do have a number of pretty severe gaps in the sorts of materials that we have. And in addition, the format of the various contributions varies slightly from contribution to contribution. As I mentioned, some of them have reading questions, some of them have Chinese characters or Japanese kana. Some do not have either of these things. So all of these issues, again, have derived in part from the fact that since this was a pandemic project entirely, we have never met as a group to set guidelines. Even Wayne and I have not met in person to talk about this project. So nothing has happened in person yet. So with all of that in mind, we're going to have this workshop this fall to achieve a few goals. We're going to review all of the existing contributions, and we're going to try to standardize the format a little bit, keeping in mind that we do want them to be as accessible as possible, certainly for undergraduate classrooms, maybe even for upper-level high school classrooms. I'm hopeful that this review of what we currently have will also help us figure out what the most severe gaps are, and maybe even start to draw up a list of things, of actual documents or actual sources, or at least specific types of sources that we think we need. And then finally, we're going to try to figure out, well, what is it going to look like? Is it going to continue to be this website, or is it going to evolve into a new source reader, right? A printed collection of materials. And then as we also think about, well, what is the future going to look like? We also need to think about funding. And talk a little about how we're going to pay for all of this, right? As the collection of materials continues to grow, we do want it to remain open access because that's what's most useful to busy instructors and students as well. We also will probably need to hire translators and editors going forward, and that, of course, all requires funding. So we will continue to develop those ideas. And we're certainly hopeful that we'll get more contributors to this project. So if you have now heard any of this and are interested in adding to our database, as it were, please do let Wayne and myself know if you're interested, so that with any luck, by the time we get to the 5th World Congress of Taiwan Studies, we'll be able to report back that we're actually a little closer to being done. And so I'm going to end my comments there, but could you maybe pull up the website? I just want to show you quickly what the website itself looks like, a little bit more than just that landing chunk. And then I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. Thank you very much. Okay, so I just wanted to quickly sort of, here are all the contributors. If you want to try it again. So here's the contributors, and God, these pictures are huge. Range of scholars. Wang Feixian is talking a little later today from multiple countries around the world. I didn't mean to cut anybody off there, go through the whole list. Graduate students, tenured professors, and hopefully some of you coming up. And then the topics, you can, by chronology, I'll just run through quickly the sources by subject to show one of the ways we've divided them up and give a little bit of a sense of the sorts of materials that we have on these broad areas that I mentioned before. Some newspaper articles in there, letters, legislative UN debates, bills, journal manifestos, and things like that. And I will wrap up there, I think, even though I appreciate that I have another minute, but I think I've said all that I really have to say, but I am interested in answering any questions that you might have. And if you want to look at one of these, I can pull one up as well. Yeah, of course, absolutely. Sources by chronology. Beginning with the Japanese period, Japanese colonial period, running through martial law. Sorry. Yeah, and then on to the era of democratization is currently how we have things divided.
So yeah, I have a question. And obviously, it's an amazing pool of resources, but yeah, kind of question is that there are attempts or have been attempts at pulling together resources before, and it tends to be different kind of ministries or museums within Taiwan that just focus on one part. So my kind of question is, have you made attempts with like the National Palace Museum? They did a whole lot of collection of kind of like archives. And then there have obviously been attempts at putting together resources. So that's kind of my first question. The second question is that are you only looking at sources that are from within Taiwan, rather than say sources that are held in collections outside of Taiwan?
Sure.
So those are the two questions.
The first question, answer to the first question, no, we have not actually made contact. I mean, I don't know if you're thinking, the one collection that I'm thinking about at the National Palace Museum is sort of a collection of all the treaties, but I'm sure there are others as well. So I should add that there are, among the available sources that are already out there, are a lot of treaties that have been translated and some other diplomatic documents. But we want to sort of get more down to maybe the everyday level as much as possible. But like, we would certainly appreciate getting a little more information on the efforts that have been made in the past, so that we can actually try to connect to work that has already been done and maybe figure out ways to combine forces, as it were. As for the location of creation, or location of where the materials are held.
Yes.
Okay. As long as really what we're interested in are sources that give Taiwanese perspectives, however broadly we are defining Taiwanese. So, we don't want to, I'm less interested, at least, in trying to include, for example, some of the 19th century missionary accounts. But anything that they might have gathered that might represent local voices would be great.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, I'll leave. Sorry.
So wherever it happens to be held is fine, and but we do rate it, the goal is to really present it again as much of the Taiwanese perspectives as we can. There's many of them.
Quick question. Yeah, Evan, very, very interesting. I attended the online session where this was first being discussed, and so good to see it coming along. I'm wondering if, like in the reading lists you showed, the existing materials, do you plan to use some translated short stories or memoirs, things like that?
Sure. I will. We are. Since there are a lot of short stories and some novels already out there, we're not aiming in that direction initially, but I'm certainly not opposed, especially if there are things that have not yet come to light. The fact that there's Wu Zhuoliu, there's Orphan of Asia, and there are not many other sources from that period of time. There are a few short stories here and there. I think most of the literature in translation is post-war, if I'm remembering correctly. So yeah, we certainly would include it, but it's not the top priority at the moment. Memoirs, however, would be great. So if we get like little sections of that, we've got a couple other things in the pipeline, including an oral history with one of a member of the Indigenous Brigade in the Japanese Imperial Army that hopefully we'll get that up soon as well. Thank you all. I appreciate your attention and hope to hear from you all.
Thank you, Evan. So you'll recognize our next speaker because he's our penultimate questioner, Nikki Alsford, who is from the School of Language and Global Studies at University of Central Lancashire in the UK.
So kind of when Michael invited me to kind of give a talk, he wanted me to look at this from the perspective of resources or source material. And then although that I did kind of upload a paper on a project I'm working on, I'm going to try and combine the two. And it's actually really quite pleasing to hear Evan's talk, and actually there's a real connection, and I was quite keen in asking my questions, but realized that my questions would become part of my presentation anyway. So this thing where we're having the conversations about are there links between these papers? I think perhaps there are. So let's try to see if we can do this. But so first of all, before I kind of want to do this, I kind of need to perhaps situate the types of source material that I've been looking at and have been working at with an idea towards an epistemological. I have change here, but I don't really want to change, because the way in which that kind of we are understanding Taiwan is just it is a narrative, and it's not about changing that narrative, but it's about looking at other narratives. So perhaps change is not really the right word here. Perhaps a shift is probably a bit more appropriate, a reorientation. So the work in which I'm doing is to ways in which that we can perhaps move Taiwan, as looking at Taiwan as something existing on an edge of a continent, one where we look at inbound migration. It's very land orientated. So work on Dominic looks very much at that inbound migration, and it's quite interesting that you're looking at some outbound migrations, but within this, it's very much focused on the land. So I'm going to want to kind of just make a shift by looking at Taiwan existing on an edge of an ocean, right? So whereby we look at Taiwan very much as being part of a narrative of an outbound migration as a cradle for Austronesian expansion. And the focus on this outbound migration is very much connected to the idea of oceans. So by kind of thinking about Taiwan in this particular way, and through this particular lens, we start to look at different sources. And that's really the base of what I want us to kind of talk to you about today. Kind of looking at Taiwan through this. So in 2015, I think was quite a remarkable kind of an event that happened in 2015 when three, I think it was actually more than three. I don't know if Scott remembers, but I think there were definitely three Maori writers who came to Taiwan as part of an exchange. And so the first, Witi Imahira, is famous for the whale rider, was part of that contingency of the Maori coming to Taiwan as an event that was organized by the Council of Indigenous People. Robert Sullivan, here is a picture of him performing the hongi with an Ulai resident during that same visit. And Selina Marsh, she identified kind of this interesting thing that came out of the conversations that were happening around 2015 after the event took place, where she was saying that the Polynesian links to Taiwan. So Selina was saying she has the same Polynesian links to Taiwan as a Maori, but because she is a Pākehā writer, so that means that non-Maori writer. So she's New Zealand-born Samoan. So she says that in the Maori context, she can't claim to be indigenous in New Zealand because she's not Maori, she's Samoan. But she's obviously indigenous to Samoa. But she feels that there are still these links and these connections. And so these links and these connections back towards Taiwan, I think is quite interesting. And particularly in the conversations with Witi about this idea of the whale rider and this land of where the Maori are descending. He said that in his mind, he'd always was in around the area of Samoa is this land where Pākehā was descended from. And then so he himself said that perhaps that could be relooked, and perhaps that Taiwan is this homeland of the Polynesian. So it was very, very interesting conversations. And so it got me thinking about this golden era of Taiwan studies. And I think we are very much in this. And I think we have got to a point where we can accept that Taiwan exists as Taiwan, right? And that the study of Taiwan is something that is separate from the studies of other areas. And I think by looking at Taiwan now, we can start to think about how do we understand other similar kinds of area studies. So if we could take for a moment American studies, for example. So American studies is very much understood as part of pioneer studies, right? We have in the past tended to look at this from a perspective of a settler colonial perspective, right? So the idea is that more people know about Ellis Island off of the coast of New York, as opposed to Angel Island off the coast of San Francisco. We tend to look at the westbound migration as opposed to eastbound migration, right? And then so, but that has changed. So the idea of that you can have a study of America without talking about Europeans is something that's, okay, is not too strange. And so the idea is that, can we do the same thing of Taiwan? Can we look at it from a non-settler colonial perspective? And so this event that was happening in 2015 really kind of got me thinking that perhaps, yes, we can. But it doesn't eliminate or delete or remove ourselves from having to look at these other stories, right? It's not just, I'm not making here a suggestion that we should just completely change the way we look at Taiwan. I think we still need to consolidate Taiwan studies, but I just think this is an alternative lens to do this. So one of the reasons for this is when we start to look at, so how is Taiwan similar? So Taiwan, if we just say Taiwan as a Pacific island, okay, what makes it similar? What makes it different? So if we were to say, okay, let's look at Taiwan as a Pacific island, we understand that islands themselves are not isolated, they're not tiny, and they're not remote. They're interconnected, and we can always see that Taiwan, throughout its history, has always had a form of interconnectivity. The other way that which we can look at this is that Taiwan, or all islands on the Pacific, have been colonized, right? And they are layered in their coloniality. So you don't necessarily just have a island in the Pacific where there is a single indigenous identity that is then layered with a single colonial identity. It's not that simple. We know that a Pacific island may have multiple indigenous identities and might have multiple colonial identities. So if we were to take two examples, Tahiti. So Tahiti has a French colonial layer. French is a language, but it also has multiple indigenous layers beneath that, right? If we take Fiji, Fiji's are also a very interesting place. We have a English colonial layer, but because of industry, we also have a South Asian layer of identity within Fiji, right? But it exists under a frame of an indigenous languages beneath this. So in this case, we can say that Taiwan in many ways is the only, at least for now, the only Chinese-speaking Pacific island, right? And we know that there is significant development going on in the Solomon Islands amongst the PRC. So we could see inbound migrations into the future on some of these islands where a new layer of coloniality could exist. And I think in this regard, we can start thinking about Taiwan just slightly different, but that also then gets to the point where about resources. So when Michael first asked me to kind of just do on the round table talking about resources, so I'll move that kind of discussion to resources, but I just wanted to kind of frame it in this conceptual conversation that I'm having in my own head at the moment. So no matter how we situate Taiwan, we need to think about these things in multiple layers, right? And so for me, I've been looking at particular kinds of resources that look at that indigenous story on Taiwan. And so this is where I'm going to try to see if I can kind of link it back to this conversation with Evan's conversations on resources. So in 2011, I went to the School of Oriental and African Studies. My PhD was funded by the Shuni Museum of Formosan Aborigines and the Council of Indigenous Peoples. Part of that was that my job was to uncover source material on Taiwan that is held in overseas collections. And so part of that initial project was to look at the sources of 19th century mission archives. So that book was published not long, I think 2012. 13 on looking at those early source material. Then I was asked to kind of expand on that and not just look at 19th century missionary archives, but to look at some of the other archives. And so the two other archives of which I worked at, and I think, Evan, this one could be something that we could have conversations with, is the Christian Aid archive, which was very, very interesting in looking at this in a post-war period of whereby, although Christian Aid it sent funding abroad, it was very much managed at a local level. And so I published a paper that talked about that archive, as well as the book Buried Treasures, which was published by the Council of Indigenous People, I think around 2014, 2015. And so whilst working through series of photographs and letters and memoirs, I started realizing that actually what was embedded within this material is actually really quite important when we start to look at things surrounding gift exchange, reciprocity, and start looking at when particularly in the case of the 19th century, we would have a letter where we would have a memoir or a diary, and the entry of the diary would say that I exchanged my rifle for a headdress, and my guide couldn't understand that the economic value of this is not the same. Like, you know that rifle's really expensive, and the headdress, is not expensive at all. But the person who collected it would say, well, I mean, it contains symbolic meaning. I kind of want to bring one of them back. Well, that headdress that we see in that letter is now in the British Museum. And so we have a letter that links directly to the object, and we know it from the donor. So then I worked with Professor Hu Jiayu just before she passed away on this particular collection of the items that are held in the British Museum. The photographic evidence of these sources was also quite important, because this particular image you have here, which was taken in the early 20th century, is of Shaolin Village. Now, Shaolin Village, for those who don't know, disappeared after Typhoon Morakot. And so here we actually have documented evidence of places that no longer exist. And so there is a richness within this material that may not necessarily be textual, but there is this photographic evidence. And that's when I started thinking about what you were saying, is the use of photographs. So kind of linking it up into that wider Pacific thing and trying to bring some of my points back together. In 2019, a major kind of part of how, particularly in the UK, I don't know if it's the same here in the US, but one particular measure of our worth as academics is our connections to public engagement, and how can we connect to the wider public. Well, the University of Central Lancashire is in that kind of place of where industry developed from the 17th century, particularly in the area of textiles. So there's lots of people in the public that have an interest in textiles, and I'm trying to find ways in which that I can connect that through these public engagement activities. So in 2019, I created an exhibition called Woven Austronesia that brought together these collections that are being held at the British Museum, held at the Gawthorpe, which is a kind of stately home in the north of England, who has a large number of collections of textile material from the Pacific Islands. Part of this also, we brought the Fijian community choir from Bicester, which is near Oxford, to come up and to give a talk about Fijian textiles and how Fijian textiles are used. And so one of the key things here with Fijian textiles is tapa cloth, right? And the making of tapa cloth. Now, so I have been working with academics in Taiwan and looking at that migration of the paper mulberry tree. So Baka in Amis. So I've been working with the Amis community on kind of the manufacturing and the making of bark cloth, and was linking it to how tapa cloth was being made in Fiji and whether or not we have similar in their techniques. So every year as part of our course, and so I kind of perhaps just mention very briefly, that when we were talking I think it was Evan was talking about institutions that have a space for the teaching of Taiwan, I'd just say that we are really quite fortunate. So at the University of Central Lancashire, we have 5 academics that work on Taiwan, but we're not necessarily being told that we also have to kind of teach other areas. We are very much have that kind of freedom to just continue this work. And so our undergraduate in our BA in Asia Pacific Studies in the second year has a module called Taiwan in the Asia Pacific, which is a full module that just talks about Taiwan. And in the MA, my anthropology in the Asia Pacific course is the half of my class is in the UK, the other half is at Junda. And so I bring the 2 classes together. And so part of that is a travel seminar. And so we spend time on the East Coast, particularly in and around Dulan. So so this is just a picture of the exhibition, just to show you. 5 minutes, okay. So here is a kind of picture of our students in Dulan producing bark cloth. Now, COVID kind of stopped our students from being able to return, but we were really quite fortunate that this year, rather than sending our students, that we brought an Amis bark cloth maker to the UK. So one of the reasons for my sleepiness, particularly yesterday, was that, we just came off the back of this. This was last week. And so we have Futuru Sai, which is probably known to many of you in the room, but also Shiku, who is an Amis bark maker. So they came and they were doing the demonstration as part of this public engagement so that I can demonstrate my worth as an academic in the UK. The other area in which that I looked at in terms of that public engagement is work with children, young children. And so here with collaborations with the Sheni Museum, what we have done here is we have taken a very rural primary school, or here is preschool, a rural preschool, and about teaching them about movement. There was an exhibition done on movement. And so I was here going through this with his children. And then we linked that school in rural Lancashire, where most of the children are somehow connected with like farming, particularly in dairy industries, to a school in Taiwan. And they did this exchange of kind of letters and stuff like that, which was actually really quite good. I'm going to bring this to an end now, but just before I do, as a way of plugging, I currently have a call for chapters out. So if anyone is interested, please let me know. I'm looking at kind of putting together a book called Taiwan as Oceans as a way of bringing this kind of framework in. So please do consider either submitting a proposal or alternatively passing it on to your networks of people who you may think could. So yeah, well, thank you very much. Thank you. Any? Okay.
No questions?
We can talk over coffee.
Yeah.
Sorry.
As I was thinking about my own comments this morning, this is in some way going to be a comment, but maybe you'll have a response to it. As I was thinking about my own presentation, I realize we are very much privileging written sources. And there are reasons for that. Written sources are easier to work with in many cases, but there's, of course, all these material sources. And so I was wondering if maybe you could talk a little bit about how to incorporate material sources, or how you think they might be able to be incorporated. You clearly have some experience with it. So yeah, and how maybe that could be an overlap between what you've been working on and what I've been working on.
Yeah, so one of kind of the key thing with the material sources, including both image and and the actual material. So one of the areas in which that I was particularly keen, which doesn't, so I think the easiest way to do is to look at that particular book that I co-authored with Professor Hu Jiayu. So for Professor Hu, what was important was how that material links back to indigenous communities within Taiwan. So there's about 300 items that are held at the British Museum. The vast majority of that collection is Taiwanese. And that was a kind of a leftover from the 1910 British Japan exhibition when they brought over a community to put on display, right? And that material is left behind. But the other material is that was just donated to the museum. And so for me, my part was to look at the kind of that connection to the donor. So who was the donor to the British Museum collection, and what were their relationship with Taiwan? And so through a process of tracing back, and that's how the connections of a textual thing links very much to an object. And so for me, that was the key thing. The collection itself is quite important for a number of reasons. So one of the key things is that when we do look at the 19th century collection, that 19th century collection is material culture that belongs to Pingpu-Zhu, particularly Surayan. And actually, when we start looking at categorizations or being considered indigenous by the Council of Indigenous People, links to material culture provides a useful thing. So, a project that came out of this is a current work with the National Museum of Taiwan History is about how these objects can subsequently be used for indigenous recognition because they relate to that. Now, this is also another factor why we've been unable to exhibit that collection with funding from the council is because of where these collections belong to. COVID again, has actually kind of put a bit of a stop. The idea was that we would actually be exhibiting 100 pieces of that collection in Taiwan. I don't really know at the moment where we are with that because people went silent, but I'm kind of hoping that that gets picked up. So I wasn't sure in yesterday's presentations from, I can't remember now who the director is. But anyway, the presentation yesterday was done by the director of the National Museum of Taiwan History, and he talked about obviously going through their refurb. And so, he didn't make a mention that there was this extension to do this. I mean, though that was the big thing that we had a conversation about in 2019. But yeah, I mean, I hope that kind of adds to that bit. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Nikki, for that wonderful talk. And I come up here to sort of offer, again, like Evan, sort of offer a comment to, in a ways of, connecting our papers, because we are a panel, right? And the thing is, what I have, I've been listening, there are two things. One is about perspective, how we look at Taiwan history, and especially in terms of geography, the direction of migration. And I think, for the research I'm doing, of course, I look at the migration between Taiwan and mainland China, and that's sort of like you said, the land-bounded perspective, right? But that really gets me thinking, because if I continue to be interested in, let's say, mainland bird migration or even post-war migration in Taiwan, there is really this, and I've been thinking about this, it's about this larger ocean perspective where a lot of the, not only the mainlanders, but the people living in post-war Taiwan, when it's available for them to move elsewhere, especially to the United States, right? And you have this sort of circulation of people and material across the Pacific. And one of the things that we see today is the development of Taiwan's, high-tech sector, right? The semiconductor. It's sort of intricately sort of connected, between certain locations, especially Hsinchu in Taiwan, with the Silicon Valley of the United States. And that's all facilitated by this migration, right? So I would say that, maybe the perspective develop, in this case, develop for indigenous studies in Taiwan is actually beneficial to other periods of Taiwan study as well, that we can just find commonalities in terms of this perspective. The other thing that I find extremely interesting, and this really refers back to Evan's sort of the issue that is raised, that I think is really good, because as historians, or more traditional historian, we're trained to look at archival sources and texts, right? And like you said, there's a reason for it, because there's a lot of it, and they tell us a lot about the stuff that we don't know, and the society have collectively forgotten, or the things that state have basically hide, right? But then there are all these material artifacts that are actually left. We're talking about the stuff that's, when people got executed. I mean, there are all these, I've seen in the archive with the item stuffs, right? And even if you go to the Taiwan's White Terror Museum or the 22A Museum, they're like, letters or texts, right? But, written letters and all these remains, the clothing, the bag, and also the stuff that are actually made by the prisoners while they're in prison, like paintings, artworks. They're actually exhibited. And I think I understand that in indigenous studies, because they're usually only oral history and then these material artifacts, I think you guys should be able to develop, more of in terms of methodology, how to basically sort of use and interpret these materials. And we are very much looking forward as historians to be able to basically work on the artifacts that we have and incorporate them in Texas by relying on, maybe the perspective and methodologies that you guys develop. So I'm just saying that I'm really looking forward to read more. Okay, so that's my comment.
So yeah, just a kind of response to that. I mean, yeah, that trans-Pacific thing. And so one other area that I have an interest in is Taiwan diasporic literature. So if we think of Green Island of Shauna Yang Ryan or Melissa Full, Peach Blossom, very much talks about this, but coming from. So that trans-Pacific conversation does happen, and that's very much in the framework. So existing stories on Taiwan and lenses of which that we looked at does also have that oceanic narrative to it as well, and I agree. I think on the bit on materials, I think Taiwan, particularly I think from 2014, understood the importance of collecting material. So after the sunflower movement, we know that a lot of that material was collected and it's gathered and it's being preserved for later studies on the sunflower movement. And in one of the panels that we're kind of competing with us, talking about COVID, and I know that there's been efforts by scholars in Taiwan to document now and archiving material that's surrounding the COVID pandemic. We know that they did do this with SARS, but perhaps not to the extent that they are thinking about this now. And so, the documenting of material is really important. And it also kind of then links me to the importance of indexing. So part of that project that I was working with from the Council of Indigenous People wasn't just to say, oh, okay, here is a mass archive, and within this archive, this is the amount of material that talks about Indigenous people, but then this is what it is, and then the highlights of that were then published. But my other job was to actually work with the archivist to index. So if you now go to the SOAS archive, now you can, the index term for Indigenous and Taiwan now exists within that material, and that was probably the biggest part of that project that's not potentially seen. But it's always important that as new material coming, we getting that indexing on that so that it can be searched. Just very, very quickly, Evan, one kind of source material that I found to be really, really useful, but we never had an opportunity to utilize it, is the Church News. So the Church News was something that, so it's the oldest running publication in Taiwan, but its early ones was done in Romanized Hokkien. And there's not a complete collection anywhere, but there is a complete collection between SOAS and Yale. I've always been fascinated if that is because that is a local perspective, right? Because it was written by practitioners, not by missionaries. And so when we look at the archive at SOAS, it goes dark in 1940 because of the expulsion of missionaries from Taiwan in 1940. Very interesting that the archive in Taiwan then begins in 1940, right? And then the archive back in the UK kind of picks up again in 1946, 1947, and it's really quite thin then because they're like, oh, they don't need us anymore. Right. And that was pretty much the thing. So, yeah, there is. But that stuff on the Church News is very, very interesting. There's been a couple of papers that I know of that's published on that collection. But the digitizing of that collection was definitely something that I've been rallying for the importance because it is local voice. And to the best of my knowledge, it's never been translated. Yeah.
Thank you. You know how an hour and a half ago I said there's 3 totally separate papers and they have nothing to say to each other and we're going to do the questions all separate? Wow, look what happened. I'm very happy to have been so wrong about it. Our time is up and we're the break food room, as you know, and so in fairness to the other sessions, I think we should probably stop now. So let's have one last round of applause for our 3 speakers. It was great.